Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you can all hear me. Hello, across the screens. So you're all very welcome to month 2 of Book Club. Yay! I hope you're all okay with the fact that we are recording this meeting, just so that we can put it up on the VDP YouTube afterwards, so that anyone who has missed it can watch it afterwards. And Kira and I are very excited to have our guest with us this evening. So tonight we have Jean Mitchell with us, and Jean is an Irish author, and she's the author of A Dangerous Crossing, which is a wonderful book about the refugee crisis. But Jean, I think, will be able to do a much better introduction of who she is and what she does herself than I could do. So Jean, if you would like to take over from me.
Thanks very much, Niamh. Hi, everybody. Good evening to all of you. Great to see so many faces here and joining us this evening. And thanks to Niamh and to Kira for inviting me along to your VDP Book Club. It's great to see a book club focusing on political issues and items of interest that would be great for me, very interesting for me. I like all the sound of what you've been doing so far. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an Irish author. I'm based in Dublin. I write books for children and young people, and the focus of my writing is predominantly on human rights, and it's just an area of interest I have. So I tend to write contemporary, reality-based books. So I haven't written anything historical or fantasy-based. So they're all reality-based, they're all contemporary, and they tend to look at different aspects of human rights and rights for children, and particularly for young people who aren't in as fortunate a position as most of us are in that they don't have access to good education, good schools, good environments, and maybe they are facing very difficult situations than the rest of us might deal with. And that is an area that's of particular interest to me. So I know you're looking this month at the refugee crisis. So my most recent book is A Dangerous Crossing, published by Little Island, and that's looking at the experience of one boy and his family escaping from Syria. At the moment, I was telling Niamh and Kira, at the moment I'm just finishing up another book that's due for submission to my publisher this month, looking at the experience of a young woman in direct provision in Ireland. And one of my previous books, Chalkline, was looking at a young boy caught up in civil war and becoming a child soldier in Kashmir around the Indian-Pakistani border. So those are the areas that I write about and that I'm most interested in. Some of my books are on the Irish secondary school curriculum and have been on Junior Cert curriculum for young readers. And they've also been published in the States and in Brazil and different parts of Europe and in Australia. So they seem to capture the interest of people who want to know more about these situations and the issues faced by young people. That's a little bit about me, and I think there's lots of questions, and I think we're probably going to open it up for discussion. So rather than have me talking all the time, I think there's an opportunity for people to ask stuff as well. So Niamh, do you want to go on with the questions, or do you want me to talk a little bit more? Or
yeah, perfect. So our plan, just to let you all know, our plan for this evening is Kira and I have about 8 questions for Jean that were either from us or submitted to us by all of you on our Instagram or through our emails. So our plan is to go through all of those questions first, and then hopefully if we have time at the end before Jean leaves at 8 o'clock, if anyone else has any other questions they want to ask, then you can. And then after that, unfortunately, Jean has to leave us, but that's all right. And then we will be able to have a little bit of a discussion about the book that we read this month, if anyone is interested. Obviously, if anyone has to go in the meantime, that's completely fine. Stay as long as you can. And any other questions, you can send them into the chat box and things like that as well. And hopefully we'll be able to get around to them. So Kira, if you want to kick off with the questions, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jane. It was lovely. Our first question is just asking you what drew you towards writing for children and young adults rather than catering to an older audience?
Yeah, I think I had to think about that one a fair bit. I was a huge reader as a child. I used to curl up with a book at every opportunity. Anytime I went down to visit cousins or friends or whatever, I would find a book in their room that I didn't have, and I would curl up and be company for nobody for the rest of the evening. So I suppose I'm a bit of an introvert, and I have great, I live in the world of books, and I think in my head, I suppose I'm aware of the power of books for a child and how they can create worlds that the child can access through their imagination. And that is something that for me was a huge part of my childhood. And I read everything I could get my hands on. So my parents used to bring us to the local library every couple of weeks, and we'd get our 3 books or our 5 books. I would have them read in about 3 days, and I'd be looking to go back and get more. So I think it was because the magic that I'm aware books have for children and how they can open up so much to a child and teach you so much about the world around you. And especially when you're going into secondary school and then going through secondary school, you're trying to find your own place in the world. You're trying to find your own personality, your own character. You're trying to discover where you fit in. And sometimes that can be a bit of a struggle. It's hard. It's a hard transition time when you're moving through adolescence. And I think books for me were a way of exploring that and exploring how other teens did it and how they survived and they got through. And I think because of that, they hold a very special place in my heart. And I think that's why I was drawn to writing for that age group.
That was really nice to hear. A lot of that like really hit home for me as well. It's lovely to hear you say that. So I suppose a lot of your books, as you said yourself, focus on like human rights issues and a lot of social justice issues. We're just wondering, how important do you think it is to be discussing these issues with children from an early age?
I think it's really important. I studied education in Trinity, so I did teaching and I became a primary school teacher. So I suppose I would always have had a little bit of a draw towards working with children. And I like the idea of challenging children's thinking, because when you go into a classroom and when you meet with children, they're so open to ideas. They come in without preformed ideas. So when you're dealing with adults, you don't have the same degree of flexibility in their thinking. Certainly you can challenge adults, and we can all be challenged. We can all read something that open our eyes and make us think differently. But children are like little sponges, and they're learning so much. And I think there's an opportunity when you're in a teaching environment to, you don't know what families and what ideas children are coming into school with, but you're trying to open them up for them and help them to think of other things outside of their own immediate world. And I think because of that, it's really important to give children an opportunity to learn about the world that they're in, because it's not just about their immediate environment, and it's going to be their world. They are going to be the ones that will inherit the world when they grow up. And it's their world as much as the adults around them. And I think it's really important to create empathy in children, that words can create this empathy and can engender a kind of an understanding of what's going on. And I would hope from that maybe provoke some sort of action among children. So you can see the power of Greta Thunberg in the whole environmental and the whole energy efficiency and the green, sustainability. I think that's because she's thought through these things. And I think children have a great deal more power than we might realize, and more ability to understand things if it's presented to them in a way that they can grasp, and if it's within their linguistic capabilities. I think you're going to have the opportunity to show children so much more about their world.
100%. Thank you so much for that. Then this is actually a question from myself. I've read 2 of your books. I've read Chalkline and A Dangerous Crossing, and I found both times after reading them that I was really challenged to confront my own thoughts and ideas. And I was just wondering, do you find as a writer that that's a necessary part of your job, to challenge the reader?
Now that's very interesting, because I saw that question coming in and I didn't know who had actually sent it, and I wanted to ask, so I'm now going to throw it back at you, Ciara. What way did it challenge your thinking? how did you find, because it was an interesting observation you put, and I was kind of thinking, how did that challenge now the person's thinking? So do you mind me putting you on the spot a little bit?
No, not at all. So I suppose Chalkline would stand out to me a bit more because I read that book when I was in a book club when I was like 11. And
Yeah.
I just remember reading it, and a lot of the books I'd read up to that point had been about children and people who were like me, who had similar life experiences, who looked like me. And then I read this, and just the life of that young boy and the stories told in that book were just so far removed from everything I'd known. And it just kind of gave me a whole different perspective on how big the world is and how small my world was at that point. So I think it kind of challenged me to reflect and think outside of myself.
Yeah, sure. Really good answer. Yeah, thanks for that. I don't think it's necessary for every book to challenge. I know sometimes it's nice to have a book that you just want to curl up and not have to do an awful lot of worrying and thinking about and reflection. So I think it's sometimes nice to have a book that you can just escape into and not challenge yourself. But I think also at times there's a place for reading a book that makes you think of the world differently and does a little bit of a mind shift for yourself. And I think there's something very satisfying about reading a book like that. I think when you come back and you put it away and you finish it, and it's like, oh my God, I never saw the world that way before. And that can happen with a science fiction book or a reality-based book. It doesn't have to be all reality, but it does shift your whole world focus, and it tilts the world a little bit, and your expectations of the world might have expanded or been augmented or changed from what you've read. And I find it really satisfying to read a book like that. And I suppose when I'm writing, I try to think of what sort of book would I want to read. I'm often asked, do I write a book thinking of the audience? And I have to say I don't, because it's a totally selfish process in that I write a book thinking, I'd love to read this. I'd love to know what's going to happen. So it's a focus on what I'm interested in. And I don't think you're going to come across as a writer who is passionate and committed about your subject if it's not something that you would want to read yourself. But I think there's a time and a place for every kind of book. I think if people are reading, that's what I would push. I don't sort of question what people are reading. If people are getting out there and reading books and enjoying them and engaging with them, I think that's the best part.
Thank you so much for answering that for me. And then we have another question, which is just how important a part of your writing process is carrying out your research beforehand?
For me as a writer, research is central because my books are reality based. So if I was writing complete fantasy or something that was a complete made up story, research wouldn't be so important because I could do my own world building and I could create a world to be anything that I wanted to be. But if I'm writing a book that has to have an authentic narrative and has to have an authentic setting, I have to do my research. I have to make sure what I'm writing about is accurate, because even though it's not a nonfiction book and even though it's a completely made up story about invented characters, it is still based in reality. It is based in the real world, and people are going to be looking at it in detail. So for me, research is very important. And for Chalkline and for Dangerous Crossing and for my current book, I've had to do a huge amount of research because they're areas that I wouldn't know an awful lot about. And for A Dangerous Crossing, I went and I spent a week living in the jungle camp in Calais. Not living there, I didn't stay there overnight because I couldn't. But I volunteered for a week over there to give me some impression of what it's actually like to be a refugee. We can all use our imaginations, but it's only when you see the appalling conditions that people are living in and when you see that they're ankle deep in mud, because Calais doesn't have weather that's a huge amount different than Ireland, and they have constant rain, they have cold, and you have people living under sheets of tarpaulin, having come from countries like Syria and Eritrea and Ethiopia and Syria and the Sudan. And you hear people saying, oh, they're economic migrants and they're looking to sponge off society, you can only imagine that what they've had to leave behind is so appalling that they're prepared to put up with what they're putting up with. So that to me gave me a really good indication of the desperation of these people and that they really don't have a choice. And I think I needed to see that firsthand in order to get a bit of understanding. So I think it is research, but it's also total immersion and integration into what people are going through to try and understand what they're experiencing. So yeah, that's it.
That's incredible. Just really interesting to hear how much work goes into it, because obviously we just get the finished product of a lovely book, but hearing all of the work that goes into it beforehand, that's really interesting. So I think I'm going to pass it. Oh, sorry, do you want to talk to?
No, I was just going to say, I didn't, it's fine, it was just an addendum on that. I didn't go to Calais until after I had finished my first draft of A Dangerous Crossing, because I felt it would be somewhat exploitative if I went and then took all these people's stories when they're at the lowest point in their lives, and that they're at a stage, these people were very, very traumatized, very distressed, very lonely, very isolated from their families. And I wouldn't feel comfortable taking all of that loneliness and desperation and then using it to write my book. So I felt that would have been wrong. So I only went to Calais after I'd written my first draft. So I had the book written, I had the story. I went to Calais, and then there's nobody's personal experiences have been taken from Calais and put into the book. But what I did was I used it to create the horror of the refugee camp that Khalid finds himself in when he crosses the border. So yeah, I'm just conscious of that it would be wrong to use people's desperate situations for that. So sorry, it was just to come in on that last point. Yeah.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. That's very interesting. I think I'm going to hand over to Niamh now for the next question.
So the questions that we've been asking you so far, Jane, have mostly been about, your writing style and your experience as an author. But the next few questions are kind of focusing more on the refugee crisis as a wider issue. So the first question that we received is, how do you feel that the European Union's reaction or solutions to the refugee crisis could be improved? If you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, I think there's been such a mixed reaction across Europe, and I think we've seen the diversity in the response of our countries, and some that are not having a response that I would be in any way proud of. So we've seen some countries taking a very militant approach and closing their borders entirely. And I think that's just very, very sad. I think it's really, really bad. I think some of our countries, some of our European neighbours, and not the wealthiest. So you have Greece, who's not one of our wealthiest European countries, and they have borne the brunt of the needs of these terrible people arriving on their islands and on their shores. And they've been left. I have to say, I think if you've got Lampedusa in Italy, Lesbos in Greece, I think these countries have been abandoned by the greater European bloc, who have left them to take the brunt of all of these refugees without giving them sufficient support. I think Germany has done an incredible job. I don't think Ireland has done enough to be proud of. I think we've been pretty poor in our response. I think, well, our nearest neighbours who've now left the EU, I think they haven't done an awful lot to support the crisis. I think there's an awful lot more that Europe could have done. I think we've seen Poland, and we've seen some countries closing their borders completely and turning it into an armed guard response, into putting on the crash helmets and trying to turn back these people. We've seen deals done with Turkey that if Turkey keeps people, that their human rights abuses will be tolerated with, and Europe will turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses in Turkey. And I don't think that's a solution. I think if any of us found ourselves in the situation that the Syrian people in particular are in, where they're in a war and they've no choice but to get out of their country for safety, and then the nearest neighbours turn their back on them, I think it's shameful. And we should be opening our doors. Let these people in. That they are qualified. They're professional people. They're hard workers. Any of us would want a better life for our families. You know, if we were in a war situation, we would hope that the rest of the world wouldn't turn its back on us and that we would be helped. And these people don't want to live abroad for the rest of their lives. They want to find safety for their families. And an awful lot of them have now returned to Syria because that's where their livelihoods are, that's their stamping ground, that's where their homes, their families, their roots, and they're happy to return once peace goes back. So I think, I don't think we've done a good job. We're one of the richest blocks of nations in the world, and we haven't done ourselves proud. So I think we could have done an awful lot more.
Thank you for that. And I suppose on the topic then of the Irish response, what's your opinion on the recent white paper plans for moving from privatised direct provision?
Do you want my honest response, or do you want kind of a PR response?
Your honest response would be well received.
I think it's a sticking plaster. I think the government have to be seen to be trying to do something, and I think they want to be seen to be trying to do something. But I think we've got a housing crisis where we've got homeless people who are not refugees, and we're not able to provide housing and their own front doors for so many Irish people who are in desperate situations themselves. So I don't know how they can commit to a white paper to give everybody who is looking for shelter and for asylum and is looking for international protection. We cannot commit to provide them with a front door and their own house and their own place when we can't do it for our own people. So I think it's really just being seen to do something, but I wouldn't be holding my breath on this coming to reality anytime soon. And I think the very intelligent people in direct provision are well aware of that. So you have MASI, the Movement for Asylum Seekers. They're well aware that, you know, these aren't idiots that we're dealing with. These are intelligent people who are copped on and clued in, and they know the politics, they know what's going on. And I think it's good that there's something out there, but I think it's not going to go very far. You know, we're not able to deal with our own population. So that's my view.
No, thank you for your honest opinion. Definitely, I'd say there's a lot of people who would agree with you on that. So then our next question is, how do you think racism is affecting the Western attitudes towards the refugee crisis? So I suppose this question comes from a place of, you know, reading about refugees trying to integrate into a westernized society. And I think it's becoming more and more apparent that we have a lot of, you know, white immigrants. If you look at example for the Irish, we have traditionally emigrated across the world, and yet have been able to integrate very easily into society. And I think a lot of that is to do with our whiteness. Whereas you find stories and reports from refugees who are Black, brown, you know, different races and things like that, trying to integrate into a majority white society and really, really struggling with that. Yeah, so we were just wondering what your opinion is on, you know, how racism is affecting the Western attitudes towards the refugee crisis as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think it's one that doesn't have a simple answer, and I think it's quite complex. So I'm sure a lot of you would have seen the news last week where Pontins was found to be guilty of excluding people with a list of 20 Irish sounding names. And they were saying that nobody with the name of Murphy, O'Donoghue, McDonough, Mars, Stokes, they have a list of names, and they've been found that they exclude all of those people from their camps because, again, it's a racism thing, and they're trying to steer mainly against people from traveling community, that they shouldn't be allowed into Pontins, but it was anybody with a list of about 20 Irish names. So I suppose we're not, because of our white skin for the most part, we're not as obviously a different nationality than a lot of Europeans. But I think from Irish names, there is racism out there. I also, I also think that racism isn't only a white skin issue. And I've become more aware of this when researching my current book on direct provision, because I've met a few young people who are in direct provision, and I went to the Maasai conference that was held about a year and maybe about 15 months ago. And they had young people in direct provision talking at the conference. And there is racism within Black and brown people against darker skinned people. So a couple of the younger, and this took me aback, I have to say, it did take me back. And I suppose this is a little bit like Kira saying earlier, that her thinking was challenged when she read Chalkline. I suppose my thinking was challenged a little bit when I went to the conference and I heard about the brown girls in the refugee centres don't talk to the Black girls, and the Black girls, if they're very dark skinned, they find it harder to talk to the lighter skinned Black girls. And I wasn't aware of that level of it within a direct provision centre. And I suppose I shouldn't be. I suppose in my own head, I was thinking, oh, racism is a white privilege, but clearly it isn't. So I think it cuts across all societies, all populations, and I don't think it necessarily has only to do with the color of your skin. I think it can do with your name, your background, whether you're one of the traveling community or not, whether you're dark skinned or not. And I think it has a broader application than just racism against dark skinned people coming here to Ireland. It's a very long-winded answer, isn't it?
No, thank you. And then I suppose the final question that we have written down here is, what role do you think the media plays in reporting the refugee crisis, and are we being misinformed in a way that is making us hostile and desensitized? So this is my question, and the reason that I wanted to ask you was because one of the lines in the book that we read this month, it talks about the media representation of the refugee crisis. And there's a line in the book, and I was looking for it there and I found it, and it's talking about how newspapers often say that, you know, refugees are going into these amazing countries full of wealth and everything. And the quote that I found here is, "Looking down from high above, an honest image isn't a flood or swarm," referring to a flood or swarm of people. It's a small stream or a thin dying herd finding its way onto a vast fertile land. So I was just wondering what your opinion is on that, because I feel like a lot of the time the media can be quite vicious towards refugees, and I was wondering what your opinion is on that.
I think the media are going to promote whatever sells their papers. They're a business, and they want to respond to the public. I suppose how the public are responding, they are going to respond in turn and feed whatever they're getting back from the public. I think we've seen this global upheaval and the seismic shift of people around Europe and Africa and the Middle East. And it's actually the greatest migrant upheaval since World War II that we're seeing at the moment. And it's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. And if and when things settle a little bit, but you know, we're seeing greater population movement than we've ever seen since World War II. And I think when things settle, and hopefully they will at some stage, there is going to be a different world. There's going to be different countries, different nationalities, there's going to be a much greater melting pot around the world than there is. And I think the media is not serving itself well in how it's portraying this. And this was one of the huge factors in favor of Brexit going through, because you had that horrendous image of lines and lines of refugees, like we would have seen during World War II, when you had mass movement of populations to get away from the persecution in their countries. And you had that image, I think it was from Bulgaria or from Romania, where there were lines and lines of people, and there was kind of, you know, sensationalist headlines splashed across it about, you know, do we want all these people taking our jobs in the UK, or do we want them drawing down all the services from the NHS? What's going to be left for our own people? So I think the media can be vicious. I think it can twist things to suit themselves. And I think in writing my book, I think all of us, regardless of our own age and our own experience and our own awareness of the world, I think we all struggle to make sense of something as massive as global upheaval and a seismic movement of whole populations. I think that's difficult for any of us to get our heads around, because we're talking about numbers that our minds can't quantify and that we can't understand. Whereas I think if you bring it down to the human level of one story, one name, one family, I think it becomes easier to understand. And I think that's why in my book, I've tried to tell one child's story. So I haven't looked at, you know, the masses of people who were leaving Syria at the same time as Khalib and his family, because I think that's too hard for us to get our heads around. And if we as adults struggle to understand it, and struggle, I mean, the fact that we're all here tonight and we're talking about, you know, political issues, human rights issues, and we're struggling to understand it, I think it just shows how difficult it would be for a child, and for a child, a young reader. And when I talk about a child, I'm talking about somebody from 12 up who's reading my books, who is struggling to get their head around what they're seeing. And they're very aware of it. So they're seeing some portrayal. They know the first time they come to a dangerous crossing isn't the first time they're going to be aware of what's going on in Syria. They will have seen it at whatever level in their family homes, if it's on the internet, if it's on the radio, if it's on the television, if it's on newspapers that their parents are buying, and they're seeing their headlines, they're seeing the images, and they're getting their own, maybe a little bit twisted version from the media, and they're trying to make sense of it in their own way. So I think when you try to put it into a book as one child's story and one family story, and present it as it is for one family, I think that helps a child to understand. And I think that's why there's a responsibility on me as a writer to ensure that what I'm portraying is an accurate portrayal. And you were asking earlier about research, but I think if my book is being used by a child to make sense of what they see going on around them, I think there's an onus on me to make sure it's a balanced representation and it shows the desperation that many of these people are going through. Not all of them, but many of them are. And I think the media, I don't think it can be trusted, because it's run by vastly wealthy, vastly powerful people who are looking to sell more of what they produce. So they're going to produce whatever salacious details they think people will be interested in. And if that means casting very traumatized people in a bad light, well, I think that's what they're going to do. So I'll get down off my soapbox now.
No, thank you so much for that, Jane. Ciara and I are now done grilling you. I'm sure you'll be happy to know. But we want to open up, you know, to the floor now. If anyone else has any questions for Jane or any comments that you'd like to make or anything like that, just maybe, you know, put up your hand and we'll call on you and things like that. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Cathal, do you want to go? You can unmute yourself and talk if you want.
Hi, thanks, Ciara. I just have another quick question, Jane, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no worries, Cathal.
Sorry if this was covered as well in the beginning, because I had a few technical difficulties when I was joining. But I'm just wondering if you found any difficulties with getting published, like writing about the themes that you write about. You know, I could certainly think of, you know, reasons why publishers might be inclined not to take books on that deal with, you know, the refugee crisis or direct provision. So I was just wondering if you could possibly talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, my books would not be the blockbusters and the mass market sales. You would definitely not put them in that category. And my writing style isn't mass market either. I tend to have quite a literary style in my writing. I've been very fortunate with my publishers. So Chalkline, which was published in 2009, I think, was taken on by Walker Books in the UK, and it was. I was very fortunate to engage with an editor there who had a very personal interest in human rights, and she really championed my book and wanted to definitely wanted to publish it, was very keen to get it published, and then she contacted Amnesty International, who then endorsed the book. So that was a great bonus. After that, I went through a fairly fallow period because I went to Palestine and I wrote a book from the point of view of a Palestinian child. And that was something that was not, it was too partisan. Now that I look back on it, it was very partisan. And I suppose I should have tread a more balanced line between, what's going on in that country and the history of the country and so on. But I suppose I was a little bit too passionate in it. So that didn't gain any traction with publishers. And that's, as you say, it's not something that somebody embraces very quickly. My current publisher is Little Island, and they're an independent publisher in Dublin. And they brought out an anthology about 5 or 6 years ago called Once Upon a Place. And they invited a lot of Irish authors to submit a short story for this anthology. And I wanted to write, it was about a sense of place. So it was somewhere in Ireland that meant something to the author. And after that, we were free to write about whatever topic we wanted to. So I wrote about direct provision. I don't name it, but the child in the book in my story is going through direct provision. And after that was published, Little Island approached me and they asked me, would I be interested in writing about something in the area of an immigrant family refugee family leaving Syria. And that's how Dangerous Crossing came about. And they've also commissioned me to write the book on direct provision. So I'm very fortunate that they're a very prescient, very tuned in, very sensitive to political issues, and they are quite a literary publisher, and they're looking to have a presence. And because they're independent, and because they're not a big publisher like Walker or like Penguin or Random House, they don't rely on massive sales because they tend to have small sales anyway. So they're not looking at large sales numbers. And I've been very fortunate to be with them now for the last couple of books, and they're going to be publishing this book as well. So yes, Cathal, to answer, it is challenging to get published with this kind of a topic. But I've managed so far, so that's good.
Thank you, Cathal, for your question, and thank you, Jane. That's a very interesting and educational answer, I think. If anyone else has any questions that they'd like to ask, fire away. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Jane. Thank you, Niamh, for letting me talk. Throughout your kind of research, I guess, in kind of the field, have you noted any kind of, changing elements throughout, I guess, the period you've done your research in, especially in the grounds of like intersectionality? In my head, I'm kind of picturing, especially from like a legal side, I know there's been a lot of cases kind of fighting for environmental refugees and their rights, and how they haven't been accounted for in previous like legislation. Would you kind of have any specific groups that you kind of point to in the future that would kind of be taking the main stage and be affected, I guess, disproportionately?
I can't say that I've picked up on that, Tom, now, to be perfectly honest. I think because of the focus of my research, I probably have been looking to a greater extent at the experience of a particular group of people. So, for example, coming from Syria and then going to Calais, I was looking at the general experience of refugees and how it is for them and the trauma they're going through. So I wouldn't have picked up on the difference that you're talking about and a change over a period of time among groups of refugees, or how they're viewed, or how there's a difference in approach towards different groups coming from, environmental refugees and so on. I wouldn't have been as tuned into that maybe. So I can't say that it's something I'd know about, having seen a lot of. Can't help you there.
That's okay, thank you.
No worries, no worries.
Right, that was actually a really interesting question though, Tom, like thank you for that. I think one thing that I noticed when I was reading the book we're currently reading is that they talk a lot about economic migrants, and I know, Jane, you said yourself that you didn't notice much of a difference in terms of things like that, but I just think it's really interesting how we class different refugees in different boxes and things like that, but that's just a personal take.
When we were in Calais, or when I was in Calais, one of the daily things that we did was we would bring donations down to the camp and distribute them to people. And I think for me it highlighted the desperation of people, and I think the common message I got from everybody in the camp, that there were two things, and this is actually an activity, is probably going slightly off topic now with yourself, Tom, but two things that when I go into a classroom, I ask them if they had to leave their homes, and if they had to leave their countries, and if they had to leave their lives behind them, what would they bring with them as essential? What would they bring, and what would they see as they couldn't manage without, if they had to leave their countries and their families? And it's really interesting what children come up with, and depending on the age group that you're with. So younger children can't leave without their teddy bears and without their fleece pajamas and so on. And then you go to secondary school, and secondary school children talk about water and warm clothes and food and money. But when I went to the camps in Calais and spent some time there, the two biggest things were things that we weren't always able to provide. So we would go out and we would distribute coats and jackets and warm clothes. Warm clothes were so important because these were people coming from Ethiopia and Eritrea, coming from drought-ridden areas, coming from Syria, and they didn't have warm clothes. They were arriving in Northern Europe, having traveled for days and weeks and sometimes months. And we would give those out, but we weren't able to give the two things. And I'm just interested to see if anyone would have any concept of what you would think are two essential items that people can't manage without when they arrive. Has anyone any ideas or any suggestions? Yeah, Connell, hi.
Would one of them be musical instruments?
Musical instruments were very important for them. Very, very important, but not an essential for survival. I won't we could guess about this for ages, but the two things that they wanted, first of all, their mobile phones. And not only as a mobile phone, but if you think of the diverse functions that a phone has. So it's a map to where you are, it's a radio and a iPod or podcast if you want to listen to something. It's a torch. It's a way of keeping in touch at home, so you can always get a SIM card and stick it in. You can always go to a library or a cafe and get free Wi-Fi. So a phone it has a camera on it, so you can have all your family photographs stored on it. So a phone was essential. The other thing that we weren't able to give people was strong shoes, strong boots. Because we had people who had walked for weeks and months wearing flip-flops, wearing sandals, and the medic volunteers in the camp spent their time treating foot conditions that they hadn't seen in people and were only known about back in World War II and World War I from the trenches. So we have people living for weeks in mud and puddles up to their ankles in their bare feet. And we all know how miserable it is if you have a blister or if you have sore feet. And these were, you know, children from 14, 15 up to adults and older people walking around in bare feet. And that was one of the biggest things. And it's not something you can donate to somebody, because if it's the wrong size, it's not going to be any good. I mean, I can give any of you a coat, and if it's too big for you, doesn't matter, it'll still be a warm coat. It'll still protect you from the weather. It'll still keep you warm. But if I give you a pair of boots and they're a size too big or a size too small, they're going to crucify your feet. So it's really hard to find donations of shoes. That's a complete side to what we were talking about, but I just wanted to tell you that because it was such a sad thing to be dealing with when you were in the camp.
That was really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if anyone has any last questions. We're coming up to right now, but even if you don't want to talk, you can type it into the chat, whatever works for people.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Hi. Yeah, I suppose I just have a question that I was just like, obviously, like through like reading and educating yourself is like such an important part of, I suppose, understanding all these like really like pivotal issues. But I was just wondering if you get any opinions on like kind of what else you could do, like what would your opinion be on like what else you could do, I suppose, to play your part in like, yeah, in helping these issues, and I suppose especially as young people. Do you have any recommendations or your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Emer. Thanks for asking. Good question. I think there is a ton of stuff people can do, and I know as a society and as a group, the fact that you're all coming together and meeting and committed to spending your evening talking about these issues shows that you're already doing a lot of stuff together and you're tuned into it. I think starting off with your own education and your own awareness, you're certainly doing that. I think for me, I try to support anything that I see that involves human rights, whether it's supporting it by signing petitions. There's so many online petitions, by writing. So I've written to Israeli government when they've imprisoned Palestinian children. I've written to political groups when they've breach some environmental right or some human right that I feel very passionately about. So there's always letters you can write from the comfort and safety of your own homes. You can write letters, you can write emails, you can get out on the street. And I know Niamh and Ciara were telling me that your society is normally far more hands-on and getting involved in stuff. So there's always things you can do on the streets of your own hometown, regardless of where that is. You can volunteer in Vincent de Paul shops, you can volunteer in charity shops, you can help on soup runs, and then you can go that much further and get stuck in, like I did going out to Calais. My first choice was I wanted to actually go to the island of Lesbos, where the migrants the refugees were coming in on boats from Syria and from Turkey, and that was my first choice. But I had a colleague of mine who is a doctor, and he went out. He's amazing. He went out to Lesbos, and he spent about a month out in Lesbos providing medical care to people as they arrived in off the boats with all sorts of medical problems and exposure and hypothermia and dehydration. And he was providing help on the beach, and he would just get up in the morning and go down and spend the day at the beach. And he did that for a month. And he talked to me about it at length before I went out. And he said to me that he didn't think I should go to Lesbos. And I was saying, why? I want to go, I want to do something. And he said, well, you're on your own out there. He said, you're not with any organized group. So he said, you get up in the morning and you walk to the local supermarket and you buy, I don't know, a couple of dozen bottles of water and a couple of dozen bunches of bananas, and you walk down to the beach, and there are a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen other well-meaning individuals, all trying to do the right thing and all down there for the right reasons, but they're all operating completely independently of each other. So you give out your bottle of water to the first family that arrives in, and you give out your bananas, and you give your energy bars, and within a couple of hours they're all gone, and then you're walking back up to the supermarket again. And he said that's a hard graft. He said it's hard. He went out with 3 or 4 friends, and they organized themselves into a kind of a medical group to help people coming in. But he said doing it on your own is really, really tough. And he said if you really want to do something, and if you want to help, you're probably better going out with an organized group. So I went out with Care for Calais. Well, when I say I went out with them, I traveled myself over to Calais. I found my own accommodation, and I then linked in with the charity when I went out there and gave my time to them for the week. And in fact, before I went out, I was advised by Care for Calais not to tell my Airbnb host what I was going out for, because they said sometimes Airbnb hosts aren't always welcoming of helping people who are out to help the refugees. So I didn't tell my host, but I'd go out every day to the camp. And at the end of the week, she said to me, so how was the work in the camp? Was it good? So she knew where I'd been going every day. And I'd been trying to be really low key and quiet and not draw attention to myself. And she said to me, what are you out here for? And I said to her, oh, I'm doing a bit of work out here. But she knew the whole time what I was out there for. So I think there's something you can do, Emer, at every level, and that I can do at every level, whether it's writing books to tell a child what's happening, to writing postcards, right up to getting stuck in and hands-on. And then there's becoming completely immersed and joining something like Médecins Sans Frontières, which is a charity that's very close to my own heart, and I'd love to do some work with them at some stage. So there you go, lots of ideas. Anything else anybody wants to ask? Because I'm going to duck off in the next 3 or 4 minutes, unless anyone has anything you want to just ask me about before I head off. My doctor friend who was out in Lesbos, he's passionate about Palestine and the rights of the Palestinian people and how there's an apartheid regime out there. So he gave his children, who are adults, well, they were teens at the time, he gave them a couple of buckets of paint, and he told them to go outside, and they had a garage in their own house, and to paint Free Palestine on the wall of their garage. And when they were doing it, the guards came up and said, what are you doing? You can't be vandalizing garages, and what are you doing this for? And they had to turn around to the guards and said, no, it's our house, and our father told us to go out and paint it on. So his heart is in the right place. He's great.
That's great. Gillian, thank you so much. I'm very conscious that it is now 8 o'clock. And thank you, Emer. That last question was literally perfect, just to round up so nicely at the end. I couldn't have phrased it better myself. So thank you so much. And yeah, Gillian, I think just on behalf of everyone here, and especially on behalf of myself and Ciara, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all of your correspondence. Personally, I feel very inspired after hearing you speak tonight. So yeah, just a massive thank you from everyone here.
Not at all. And Niamh and Ciara, thank you both so much for getting in touch with me. It's been an honor to come along and to meet so many enthusiastic young people whose hearts are in the right place, and you're doing stuff out there. So keep up the good work and enjoy your reading club, your book club, and your reading. And thanks very much for having me. It's been a great honor.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care, guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, book club's class. That's all I'm going to say. Welcome to book club. So, just now, for anyone that has, even if you haven't read the book and you want to stick around for a bit of a chit chat, we're just going to have a little convo about the book that we read this month. which was an ungrateful refugee, or the ungrateful refugee. There's so many people here tonight. This is so exciting. Thank you all for coming. But yes, if anyone has any thoughts or anything, Kira, I don't know if you have anything you want to say to kick us off.
Not especially. I suppose just to ask by like, for anyone who did read the book, is there anyone who enjoyed it or the opposite, didn't enjoy it and just want to share that?
I really enjoyed it, and I'd never heard of the book before. So yeah, no, like I was really glad to get a few like recommendations as well, just from the Instagram page of like some other books related to the refugee crisis, because like I hadn't known that much about the refugee crisis before this summer, when like all the infographics on Instagram and everything. So yeah, I thought it was really good, and it was a really good topic as well to choose. And thanks for organising the talk as well. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, Amy. That was lovely to hear. I have to say, this was recommended by Cathal McGuinness and Tom Hegarty, both through our Instagram, and I have to say I enjoyed it so much. It's one of the best books I've ever read. I really, really loved it. I just thought it was so interesting, and just I loved the way she kind of mixed together her story and the story of other refugees she'd met and worked with, and kind of how I felt like you were almost on the journey of her writing that book with her as she went through kind of like all the places she went to, all of the research she did, all the people she talked to. I just thought it was a really interesting way to write a book and really immersive experience. But I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, I also really enjoyed the book, and yeah, also it was like my first book to read about the refugee crisis, so I found it really eye-opening too. But I loved how she weaved the stories together as well, but she touched on so many issues, like about, you know, believing stories, and about like how people would spend 10 years in a country with illegal status and like living on the streets and still they're not believed. It's just crazy. But I found the thing that Niamh brought up earlier about like racism also really interesting, and about how she, just because she was a lighter skin tone to her brother, like found it easier to integrate. But I also, one of the things that like stood out for me about the West, like just not like welcoming people. And actually I have a quote, my favorite quote, and it's about when the author goes and visits a refugee camp and sees like where people are living, but a family have decided to decorate it in yellow and blue, and she says like how that's, you know, on trend, and how she says what tantalizing self-harm to Google house decor and be confronted with London showrooms to see that the decadent world outside gorges while complaining that you exist, that you might come too near. And I just found like this quote really summed up how in the West we're so, I feel like people's worry about the refugee crisis is that people will come and like rob all our resources, even though these are like resources that often the Western countries have taken from these countries, but also how like we overconsume so much, like waste so much food, waste so much with materials, and yet still we're so unwilling to share it. And that quote just like summed it up for me about how, I don't know, we just need to be more selfless in general. So that was my take. Sorry, that was long.
No, thank you so much for sharing, Emily. That was so lovely, and for you to read out the quotes. That was so nice to hear. Epi, am I saying your name right?
Yeah, it's like Ellie, but just Epi. I guess like for me, it really like put like the context, you know, Kawe's story of how he like taught himself English through easy readers, and then he got into college, and then like in order to be able to go to college, he was like working night shifts and then going straight to college and working the whole day, and it like really contextualizes how important an education is, and like especially this semester, because I think so many of us are like, oh, it's online, it's so tough. And I think like for me, reading that book really reframed like, no, like even it being online is such a privilege, not having to work, not having to worry about bills and stuff like that. So I think it was just such an important book to read, particularly during lockdown when like your whole kind of like worldview was kind of changing anyway. But yeah, I just thought it was fantastic, like overall.
That was great, Epi. Thank you so much. And I thought you brought up a really interesting point there about kind of like how privileged we are and the opportunities that we have. And I felt like that was something that this book really challenged me in, was kind of, again, acknowledging like all of this privilege that I have and kind of all these opportunities that we have and how unfair it is, how imbalanced that is across the world, the opportunity and privilege that there is for people. And so I don't know if anyone had a similar experience of kind of having that challenged while reading the book. Also, if at any point anyone just wants to come in and talk, it's very...
Yes, Kira, I agree with you. No, Kira, I actually do agree. I'm a massive nerd, for any of you who don't know me, so I had quite a few little highlighted passages in this book, but I think something that really, really hit me was literally the first 3 words of the book: we became refugees. In the sense that it's like, people didn't choose this, you know, no one chooses to have to leave their home because of conflict, because of violence. You know, this is a situation that these people have had no control over whatsoever. And I just find that so poignant. Like, you know, at a really base level, that could happen to any of us, you know, like, so they became refugees, they became people that, you know, needed help. And whilst we are so privileged to have the opportunities that we have, something that was really highlighted to me in the book is that these are very clever, very well-educated people who, when taken out of their home situation, are just not respected at all. And yeah, I just thought that just really shocked me, and that was something that, you know, like as Kira was saying, something that challenged her, and that was definitely something that challenged me, that like we are reducing people to the status of refugee without seeing them as, 1, a human being, and 2, as loving, compassionate, caring people, and 3, as clever, educated people. You know, like in the book, like Dina's mother is a doctor, and then she's not respected when she goes to America because she's an Iranian doctor, you know. So I think that was something that really challenged my belief. If there's anything that, you know, particularly challenged anyone else or really made you think, you know.
I had a similar thing, Neve, and it's maybe a bit more general. It kind of happens across a lot of social issues, and it's maybe a problem I have in general, but this book in particular, like, it's really frustrating, and I suppose that's maybe a good thing when you're reading something like this, that it's meant to invoke that feeling in you. But what you're saying, Neve, about like how we degrade people, because they are people. It's not like, you know, we have this notion, unfortunately, where we kind of have these labels of migrant or refugee, which of course are accurate, that's just the word, but similar to, like, say, it has the same effect almost as like a homeless person, where that has become normalized. And without thinking about it, almost a lot of us would have, or not people here, I imagine, in this call, but like, you know, a lot of people in Western civilization, let's say, would have preconceived notions when they hear stuff like refugee and migrant. And it's exactly as you said, Neve, that like it would be a lesser view, which is really sad and frustrating. But it's just like the lack of empathy is what stood out to me, because it's so that's kind of why I said it's almost beyond this book. And it's like, it's almost, to get very meta with it, it's a reason that I find it very difficult to read these books. And actually it was more so to do work this time than that, but I didn't actually get to finish it. But the bit that I did read, it was like, I was thinking of like how, especially for a book like this, in a world that's so driven now by snapshots of, like, I know we talked about a bit with Jane, where it's like the media having influence, and it's so easy for people to just like tear these things down instead of investing the time to actually read about it. And it almost feels kind of, it sounds very negative, but like it's almost like hopeless, where it's like, are the people who are needing to have their opinions changed actually going to take the time to read and understand this book. I think it's easier for them to read some extremist right-wing news article and be like, oh, whatever, who cares about these people? But it's just an interesting thing that, like, a friend of mine said to me a while ago to do with this is, like, think back 100 years ago even, and no one in Ireland would have any notion of what's going on in Syria or in those parts of the world. And yet these days, like, we feel entitled to have these opinions over what? Like, how many people have actually interacted with someone who is a refugee, and people still feel entitled to have all these hateful views towards people. And yeah, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, so obviously no one here, things like that, but like, it is very frustrating, because I was reading it and I was like, this just makes so much sense. Like, how can people have any sort of ill will towards someone they've no idea of, any sort of, that they've no way to empathize there, and yet they cast all this judgment. So I don't know, that was a bit of an event, not really much of a productive productive conversation, but it occurred to me when you said there, just that, like, empathy was the key word that kind of stayed to me with this, is that if everyone took the time to actually read stuff like this and to think about it instead of jumping to conclusions and wanting to feel empowered over other people, like putting other people down to put themselves up, it would just be a magically like just a better world like that, and this wouldn't be an issue, which is sad. But
I really agree with Conor. I haven't read the book, but I found this conversation incredibly interesting. But I really agree with Conor in the idea of, like, particularly, and again goes to media coverage, but like when, and like for homelessness or refugee crisis, is when the media brandishes anything a crisis, before you hear about people, you hear numbers, you hear stats and figures and all these different, like, it's all about like percentage and, you know, huge numbers. And when you're just dealing, and I think Jane kind of touched on this, when you're dealing with such huge, like, unquantifiable numbers, like, that you can't imagine in your head, that, like, people are like, oh, well, then it'll never be fixed, so we don't need to try because it's such a mountain. But like, even when we're talking about like a refugee or a homeless person, at least then you're like, okay, well, that's a person, that's a human individual that we can see and engage with. And I think like that kind of like discrepancy between media coverage of, like, media coverage isn't covering the journey of one person, it's covering, like, you know, Fox had this whole polemic about like the migrant caravan, right, which was just, you know, nonsense, but like was crazy outside, you know, this idea. And like, you know, we've all seen what everything Trump said about the, you know, the refugee crisis on the border, at the Mexican border. So like, it was all crazy. It was all numbers and figures and totally miscued data, but it was data. It wasn't people. It was just numbers. And I also think that, just to go back to Connor's point on empathy, I think the thing is, the bit that boggles my mind is the countries that we were talking about earlier, like Ireland and Poland, are countries that have had to send immigrants so often. Like, we all know, like, Ireland famously had to do it. Poland did it during World War II. I mean, like, and it's so interesting that, like, these countries are so quick to forget the time at which everywhere else had to, you know, accept them as immigrants. And I think, you know, I think Irish people have a habit of going abroad and then saying that we're expats, or any word that isn't immigrant, because, you know, immigrant is seen as like, you know, we might not be refugees, but we definitely aren't, you know, we're, you know, using immigrant is still a term that, like, I don't think a lot of Irish people would use if they go to, even if they go to America or somewhere, you know, where they're moving anywhere else. I think, you know, our views on terms like immigrant and refugee and migrant are like tainted just like by media coverage, by the media we consume. And I think that that's, you know, I think how quickly Western countries are to forget the place they had when other people reached out to them to help, and we're just like, nope, sorry, not here. I mean, of all the countries to not have empathy, I think like Ireland in particular is one to just, it blows my mind. So yeah, sorry that I haven't read the book, but I hope that helped.
Well, that was great, Connor. Thank you so much. And to everyone else, like, no stress if you haven't read the book. It's not a big deal at all. I think actually something that came up. Actually, Emily, do you want to talk? Were you going to say something?
Sorry. Before you changed just on those topics of like empathy and privilege, they also really like struck me too, especially with empathy, about how like I noticed when refugees were in a refugee camp, the West sort of thought like, oh, you should be grateful because we provide you with the basics of food and shelter and clothing, but we will strip you of everything else that makes you human, like your right to work, your dignity, your pride, like we'll just ignore all of your cultural heritage and where you came from and all that you knew and provide you with the basics and then expect you to be like forever grateful about it. And I think that really showed like a lack of empathy, that we don't even see these people as like often victims of trauma, like lack of understanding for what they came from. We just think like, oh, if you get these basic needs, then you should be okay and like just stay quiet, rather than showing empathy for all of their other human needs. And I think then that also ties in with like the privilege, like you were saying, Kira, about how privileged you felt when you read it. And I also realized like when someone talks about their struggles and it's a struggle that you have never ever thought of, I feel like that's the ultimate privilege, because I've gone my life like never having to worry about this. And that was one thing that Dina, when she moved, and I found it really sad that the whole book, she never really came to a resolution about it, about her kind of integrating into a new culture and still accepting her Iranian culture and trying to be both Iranian and American, and going through phases where she would have Iranian friends or then reject her, like the Iranian ways of her father and things, is embarrassing. And like when I move abroad, I've never felt the need to like reject my Irish culture, because I feel like that also ties in with racism and about like the West being superior, white people and English being superior, and you need to learn English to get anywhere in this life. That's kind of like what's painted in the book. And like, I don't know, that was also such a struggle for her and something that I never had to deal with, which I think is also such a privilege.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Emily, and a point you raised there about kind of like how we strip people of their dignity. She had a really interesting quote in it, and she was like, refuge is the priority for the moment, but I think when she was like, dignity is the next priority, I thought that was just such an important point to make, and I really thought that was very interesting.
Also, just before we move on from that, like I just wanted to add, like I thought what you said there, Emily, about like seeing the individual was really important, because that's something that comes up in the book again and again. You know, it's like, I think there's a part in the book where it's like, if there has been like a crime done to you, or you know, some kind of hurt, like it's better if it's being done to you and only you, and not to people as a group, because if the criminal can see you as an individual, then the state has to recognize that this has been done to you as an individual. And that is heartbreaking. Like that is just one of the worst things I've ever read. Like, so I completely agree with what you've all been saying about like the complete lack of empathy. And I think it's something that in like on a governmental level, like which obviously we can only, you know, theorize about and talk about, but at a governmental level, like as Connor was saying, you know, we see data and we don't see people, you know, and I think that was something that really hit me in the book, was that I was finally seeing people and reading the stories of like individuals.
I think you're on my mind, Neve, because I was about to say that as well, is that like that was something I found so interesting about this book, is that it now, I think this book club has actually introduced me to already more books around this, like these topics, than I've ever read, because as I kind of hinted at, I get quite frustrated reading them, so I often just get restless and have to do stuff instead of reading about it. But this is so interesting that it was a narrative structure, because exactly as you said, Neve, like it grounded it really well. And compared to the book that we read the first month, Women Don't Die Pretty, that was like, it was a broad overview, and she did go into a lot of detail on different things, but this is an interesting contrast where it's taking the complete opposite, and it's saying, here are the people, like this is actually what's going on. And that's, for something that's as nuanced as this, I think that I really liked that approach anyway. I think it was much more effective, obviously to each their own, but I thought it was much more effective than just describing at large the the landscape of things.
100%. I think if at any point anyone has something that like stood out to them in the book that they want to talk about, just go ahead. But another thing that kind of, I've been thinking about this so much recently, is how she talks about kind of like this plight of like waiting that refugees are put into, and how like their best years, especially for young refugees, how their best years are just like wasted away in refugee centres and just without being able to live their actual lives. It was something that I think really kind of struck me, especially since we've all spent the last year in kind of this like semi-waiting state where our lives aren't moving on as normal. It does just make you reflect and think that like we've only had to do this for a year, and during that time we've still had our home comforts, we'd still have this privileged position, but what must it be like for just your entire life to be put on hold and for you not to know where things are going to go next? That just must be terrifying and devastating. So I don't know if anyone has anything they want to add to that.
Yeah, I literally had the exact same thought, and just about like Corona year, but just way worse and for so much longer. And I think that again leads back to the empathy and how much we like don't value the basic rights we have, but just like right to work and stuff, that actually, like, it would be like Corona, but you don't have like college work to distract you, you have nothing, just the waiting. And yeah, I had the exact same thought.
I think that's a really interesting point, Kira, in like the context of like, and even in the context of like DPE and stuff that like we have, you know, here in Ireland, like, you know, like there are people who are born into like literally in DP, like, or like in refugee camps, and you're like, that's your entire life. And I mean, like, and obviously at that point you're so young as to not remember, but like a young refugee or young people who move and are like in these places, and like people like have moved over and have been in like in direct provision for years, like 5, 6, 7, 10 years, you know, and that, you know, and like Neve will correct me because she's a better law student than I am, but like the right to work was only given to people in like direct provision and refugees in like 2019, 1819. It was like a big constitutional case. That's and direct provision's been around for 20 years. So like that's insane that like, and I think that again, that goes to our perception, and again back to the idea of like, what's the media saying? I've had so many taxi drivers or people just be like, man, refugees are coming over here and they're coming in, they're taking all the jobs and we can't even provide jobs to Irish people. And I'm like, well, they're not allowed to work, so I don't know what you're talking about, because they can't go anywhere. People in DP can't get these jobs that you say they can get. So where is this coming from? And they're like, well, I read it in a Breitbart article, and I'm like, that's fascinating that's where that came from. I think that's interesting. But yeah, I think it's so true about like what Corona, like imagine if coronavirus was your entire your teens, your 20s, and you just went out into a regular world. You're expected to just be like, there's the world, there's the rest of it, just figure it out. And at least in like prison, they're like, oh no, well, here's a term date. Here's like, you're going to be here for this amount of time. You know, like that's all of that without any of the certainty, any of the guesswork, trying to raise families. The mind boggles how people can just like look at that and be like, it's okay. That's totally a fine thing to have in a modern society.
Can I actually throw a question out to people? Sorry, okay, thanks. One thing I found like really interesting about the book, but really difficult to reconcile with, and I was kind of confused, was immigrants or like refugees who had moved to a country and had gotten like a green card or a visa to stay there, and then their attitude towards refugees coming in. Like Dina was often talking about her grandmother who was like, I want nothing to do with them, I don't want to help them at all. And Dina was always kind of conflicted when she would go back to camps and was like, am I being mean, or am I not the person to insert myself here? Am I not helpful? But I don't know, like, what did people think about how refugees, like people who previously were refugees then reacted to refugees coming now? If anyone had any thoughts on that.
I'll get the ball rolling. That's such an interesting question, Emily. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I think, like, from my perspective, and I don't know, like, I don't think this was talked about in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suppose, like, the way I see it, you know, for refugees who have assimilated into a new culture, trying to go back in the way that Dina does is putting yourself back into a very traumatic situation, you know. And I think we can even see as the book goes along how Dina changes herself and the journey she goes on, not only the journey she's done physically as a refugee, but then as an author and a researcher, the mental journey that she goes on as she's meeting these people. So I feel like, obviously, I'm literally, like, I can't speak from any experience whatsoever, and this is just what I think, which counts for nothing. But I assume that it is very, like, it would be very much like a trauma response, you know. It's like, well, I've been there and I can't put myself back in that situation because it brings up all of these memories and stuff like that. And even there was another quote that Dina says herself, like, she talks throughout the book about her tics and things like that, and how that doesn't get better, or it doesn't change once she goes to America, once she tries to assimilate into American culture. And she says, I have exile sickness. And I think that's huge. And I think we've talked about, you know, empathy and about how, you know, the refugees are victims of massive trauma, like on a huge scale. So I think even though whilst to us it might seem, you know, really strange that surely they'd be the people that are able to empathize most with other refugees, I feel like it could be that issue of being like, I cannot put myself back into that mindset and into that situation. But I don't know, you know, what anyone else thinks about that, if anyone else has something to say about that.
Epi, do you want to speak?
Well, I was just gonna add to that because I think what comes out, particularly with her grandmother, is that, like, there's this fear of, like, having to, like, go back and look at your own trauma, but I think there's also this fear of, like, your status being taken away from you, your citizenship being taken away from you. And I think that particularly comes out with the grandmother, in that she's so scared to, like, embrace them again and look at Iranian life and, like, acknowledge that she is Iranian, because I think there's this fear of, like, they can, it's just a piece of paper, they can take that away. And I think that when you're natural born, like, I'm Irish, but I also have German citizenship, but, like, I'd never think about that being able to take away from me. But I think that comes across really strongly in the book, that, like, citizenship for them, it's such, like, it's quite fluid, and, like, it also really, like, it can just be taken away from them. So I think there's this fear that, like, it's almost easier, it's a form of assimilation or integration almost, like, if you embrace the thoughts and the opinions of Western people, going like, oh well, like, they're going to take all our resources, you're suddenly belonging to them rather than to the people you used to belong to. I don't know, that's kind of what I kind of took from the book, but I'm not sure if anyone else felt that as well.
They were actually both, like, really good answers to my question. Thank you. That really helped. I also thought maybe it was, like, a weird sort of inferiority complex, in that, like, the West are constantly pushing, like, we're superior, and, like, when you come here, like, take our culture and strip yourself of your other culture. So sort of similar to and then, like, maybe people, like, internalize that and just, like, really want to assimilate, so they completely push their old self away. But yeah, they were really good answers, actually. Thank you.
It was quite sad for me reading that, actually, that, like, Dina's taken that, because, like, it kind of plays back into what we were talking about privilege, that someone mentioned it before. I'm really sorry that I forgot who it was. I think it was Kira, basically saying like, oh, you're so lucky that you get to be a part of our civilization, basically. But like, that's completely ignoring the fact that, and like she says in the very first chapter, she's like, no, life was like paradise in at home. So like, no, you're not granting us anything here. Like, we don't have, well, the title of the book, The Ungrateful Refugee, it's like, no, we have a life, we have our own, we are people. Like, we don't have to, you know, take your scraps and that's it. And I don't know, this is a sort of again, I was thinking about these things are really general, but like what Epi was kind of saying about citizenship at large, like that's sort of a weird manifestation of how messed up our perception of culture and stuff is, that like for different economic or geopolitical reasons, like this notion of passports being more powerful than other ones is just so bizarre, and I still can't wrap my head around that. Like, and I don't know if anyone remembers hearing about this, but it was when Jane was speaking, it brought it to mind that there was that campaign a few years ago where there are 3 volunteers in Lesbos who got detained by the Greek government for trying to help refugees there, and one of them was an Irish guy who was actually in Trinity, and there was all this discussion around like, oh well, let's try and get him home and stuff, and like you can't lock him up. And I think it was only the Irish passport basically that gave him that. And you have to imagine like how many other people would be in a similar situation, and just because they happen to be born somewhere else, it's like, okay, we can't help you. I don't know, I just think that this is getting very socialist altogether, but like, you know, there's so many ways that borders are just so negative for people, and you're like, why can't people just be more tolerant? But yeah, I don't know, I'm sure that everyone here is well on that train anyway, so I'm just whatever, preaching to the choir again. But
I'm actually doing a European refugee policy module at the moment, so this is like perfect. Especially because I could really help contextualize like a lot of the stuff, like a lot of like the policies and stuff. You can actually see how they're being like enacted. But there is one thing that we actually looked at last week, and it's the idea of like the nation state and statehood. And there's a quote, and it's something along the lines of like, as long as there's nations and states, we will always have refugees, because there's this idea of like, as long as you're separating people, like people will always not belong. And I think that really plays into what you were saying there about like it all being so arbitrary, and it just kind of being these like made up constructs that we've made up, but they're so important. And as long as like we have them, there's always going to be like some type of a problem. So yeah.
And
No, I so agree with that. Oh, sorry, do you want to go?
No, Emer, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I really agree with that. And even then just like on Connell's point and everything about how like that they had their own life, that they shouldn't just be getting the scraps. Because even like I know like I have heard like other people's opinions who like, let's say, take on direct provision, that it would be like, well, they're lucky to be getting anything in the first place. And like I suppose you kind of hear people saying that, and you just like, it just comes from a place of like complete kind of apathy, and just I don't even know if it's like privilege or what it is. And it's like, sure, they're lucky to be getting what they are getting, and kind of completely, it's just nearly like a bit inhumane to be like, well, they should be getting so much more than that. And I think it's like, that's why it's kind of nearly those people that need to be like reading books like this and like educating themselves on it, because like I think like a lot of them, like everyone here would be, they wouldn't need to be reading a book like this to understand that like, well, obviously people in like situations like these need to be like, obviously like need the basic human rights, if not like a lot more. That's why I just think that this book, and it's like, yeah, it was just really interesting, and just this whole discussion has been just like so enlightening on so many levels.
Thank you, Emer. Connor, do you want to make your point there?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep chiming in, and I haven't read the bloody book. Just on
Connor,
something
we
that
are
Epi
lucky
said.
you are here.
I just on something that Epi said, and again, I don't know how knowledgeable I am on the topic, but like another just about like nationality and like statehood, and the idea that like you're not able to make somebody like not like a citizen of nowhere. They have to have some form of citizenship. So therefore, refugees have to do it, are doing it voluntarily by leaving voluntarily, but in the eyes of like a government or whatever, they're like, well, you got on, you left, you started walking X direction. But like the reality is that they're being forced into like leaving, you know, their passports, they're leaving their whole country behind, but it's not being viewed in the same way as another country, you know, particularly a Western country, making somebody not a citizen. Do you know what I mean? Like, whereas people are being left with stateless. So like, it's interesting that like, it's like, oh, well, no, refugees are doing it, you know, because they're coming here for all these, this magical, you know, jackpot at the end of the rainbow they're going to get when they get here. And you're like, no, they're being effectively forced in being made stateless by circumstance, but everybody's viewing it as if it's some sort of voluntary decision. They're like, oh, I'm just gonna leave. And I think like that, again, it boils down to like perception and like views of like what you think, what you believe is the cause and the driving force behind the refugee crisis. Because if you think it's people coming for just, who are being moved for the like, and are leaving their home and their livelihood for the crack, for the chance to spend a wet summer in Kerry, like, no, like that can't possibly be what's driving them here. Like, there clearly has to be, it's like, Ireland's great and all, but like, we're not that great that you're gonna like drop everything and move thousands of miles away. It's like, no, they're being forced. And it's like, and again, like, there'd be something to be said about the fact that like, you're being forced out to like effectively losing you're leaving your state. You're not stateless, like you are from where you're from, but you're losing all of the benefits that like citizenship, passports, etc. are being given by like going to become a refugee. I think like that's very, you know, interesting. I don't think it's like talked about enough. I think what Abby was saying about like, as long as we have borders and states, we're going to have people who are refugees. And I think like that's, I think that's so true. And I think that, you know, who drew these lines anyway? Who was the guy who sat down with a marker one day and was like, I think, and about here, and yeah, I'll do. So yeah, I think that's really interesting.
These are like the big brain questions of like, why do borders exist? And I'm like just fading away into existentialism. But that was fantastic. One thing now that I wanted to just bring up, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but it's something that I find shocking. Like, did anyone know about the Dublin regulation before they read this book? Leah, I might ask you a little bit if you know anything about it. I was going to come to you anyway and put you on the spot, but so Dana mentions it briefly in her book, which is it limits asylum applications to one European country. I had no idea that that existed at all. I don't know if anyone else knew. That baffled me. That shocked me. But yeah, Leah, I might ask you to speak a little bit, not even just about the Dublin regulation, but just for anyone that doesn't know, Leah has volunteered in Calais and has first-hand experience with refugees. So Leah, I am fully putting you on the spot. I apologize, but the floor is yours.
Hi guys. Yeah. So wait, just on the Dublin regulations, yeah, that was one of the things that I first learned when I went to Calais the first time. And it's nuts, I think, because a lot of refugees I mean, you're at the northern part of France, so a very, very high proportion of them are just looking to go to the UK. It's their dreamland. Like, you'll talk to people and they're just like, UK, it's dreamland, blah, blah, blah. So the Dublin regulation does come in there now, where, because often people obviously are coming from a lot further down, they have to make it the whole way up through Europe. So that's interesting, but yeah, that is a thing. And I think it's nuts as well, because again, I was trying to keep quiet in the whole when people were talking about freedom of movement, because it's one of those things that really just gets me on a rant, and I didn't want to take up the whole I didn't want to go on some hour-long rant on you, because again, I think like Conal said, we are preaching to the choir. But I mean, I could talk about volunteering and all of that for years, so if there's anything that people want to know specifically, it might be a bit better, because I didn't even know where to start, to be honest.
I suppose, Leah, how did you get involved? How did you start volunteering in Calais? Like, what inspired you to go there? You know, things like that. How did you start working with refugees?
So I don't have the best answer for this, because it was quite spur of the moment. I think many years ago, I think I spoke to a family friend maybe who had done it, and I was like, whoa, that's something I really want to do. I don't know a lot about that area. And I've been volunteering in kind of the homeless sector for a good few years. So I think that kind of piqued my social justice interest. I mean, to put a word on it, but Calais, I saw something online and it reminded me that of those years when I decided that I wanted to go. And I just booked a flight and I went. But I think I just Googled like, oh, organizations in northern France, you know, Calais, Dunkirk kind of region. And I have volunteered with the same organization as Jane Mitchell mentioned, Care for Calais, and they do great work. But the actual first organization that I went with, I don't know if people would have heard of it. They're called Choose Love. They have the Choose Love hashtag, and they're very, very widespread. I think they do a lot of work in the States actually as well. But they were just the first one that came up. So, I mean, it was naive little me just picking the first one and kind of going. There was not, unfortunately, I can't give you a better answer, but yeah, there wasn't a lot of thought that went into it.
And what was like your daily tasks or just your general day to day? Like, how were you helping out? And actually, how long did you go for as well? Sorry.
So the first time I went, I think I went for about 2 weeks, and it would have been similar the last time that I went as well. So I'm trying to think of the year now. I feel like last year has lasted 3 or 4 years. I think it was, so I did it both over the Christmas break with college, which I think was kind of a good time to go at the start of January, because they don't have a lot of people volunteering. I mean, Christmas is a big peak, and so is summer because everybody has the time, I guess. So it was a good time to go. But with regards to daily activities, it kind of depends on the organization. So the first one that I went with, they had little sectors in their warehouse. So this sector, I don't know if people have heard of these organizations, but it was called Refugee Community Kitchen, and they basically prepped hot meals for the refugees. I think I want to say 3 times a day we did distributions, but definitely a hot lunch and dinner anyway, which is great because they made all of these things that were really similar to cultures. And each of the camps, I think Jane, when she went, was most likely, because when her book was published, the jungle was still a thing, but it's been dismantled. It was dismantled in 2016. So the camps are very separate. So there's like an Afghan camp, an Eritrean camp, and they all kind of stick with people that they're obviously very familiar with culturally. And so food was one kind of thing. They also did woodyard, which it was something I never even thought of. Obviously, if you're in a camp, you need loads of wood supplied constantly to get your fires going. So I love that little sector, because it was something, a light switch goes off and you're like, oh, that is actually really useful. So that's one. And then clothes distribution as well. So you basically, with Care for Calais, their work is, it's probably easier to explain. They basically sort everything in the morning in the warehouse, and everybody goes out in the evening to the camp. So they'll do a different camp a day, just because it'd be impossible to get around to all of them. So, and then you spend the evening or the afternoon just kind of hanging out in the camp and chatting to people as well. And they get like a hairdresser station set up. And I mean, these people, again, this is touching on the point that these people aren't like just like, they're so talented, they've so many skills. So like the guys who are good at the hairdressing will come over and clip everybody's, do like that station. Other people are good at this and they'll do something in another part. So yeah, it's there's loads of stuff going on, really. That's just some of it.
Wow, thanks. That's actually super interesting. And sorry, I have another question for you, but like, did you find it really emotionally challenging and like really tough? Because even like when Dina was describing those scenes in the book, like I think I personally would just find it really hard as well at times. But yeah.
So the first time that I went, not as much as the second time. I found myself really uncharacteristically emotional the second time I went, which I was quite surprised by, because it was kind of like, you've done this before. Why are you getting so upset over it now? I think I pinpointed it to the fact that it was 365 days on, and things were identical to the way they were the year before, apart from the fact that a few organizations up and left.
But yeah, it was just really sad. I think, I don't know, I mean, like, I'm a tiny pawn in this operation of volunteering. I think if you're going to do this sort of work, we're hardly the ones changing the regulations and drawing the lines to where countries are, as Connor would say. So you can only do so much. And the small work that you do with these organizations is huge, because without it, these things wouldn't be possible. But yeah, I find it kind of emotionally distressing the second time. The first time, I think I was learning so much that my brain didn't really have time to stop and be sad. I mean, you'd see stuff and you'd hear stuff, and it would be saddening. But the second time, yeah, it was harder. I don't know. That's probably like not the answer you're looking for.
No, thanks so much. That was a very personal question, and thanks for your honesty.
Leah, would you recommend it? Would you tell us to go?
Yeah, 100%. I think there's so much you can read about things, and there's so much you can hear about them. Being there is a whole other story, for sure. I think the book, though, did a really good job at covering a lot of stuff that people wouldn't have thought about previously, though. Definitely, and especially integration into society. I think that's a big one, because I know the way that direct provision is organized in Ireland is really anti-integration. They keep these people like in the back arse of nowhere in towns that are very, like, they've been used to having their Irish folk around and knowing everybody, and they're not very welcoming. So I really like that she touched on the integration side of things. But yeah, I think volunteering in general, people always tell you, like, getting out and chatting to people, and you really get to talk to so many people, and like 99.9% of them are so lovely. So yeah, definitely recommend to a friend.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Leah. That's fantastic. So I'm conscious that we are coming up to 9 o'clock Irish time. Am I right? 9 o'clock? Yes. Okay, great. I know that there's maybe one or two people who haven't said anything. If you don't want to, that is completely fine. But I just wanted to open it up. You know, if there's anyone that wants to bring up any point that maybe hasn't been discussed before, and you're like, oh, how do I bring this into conversation? Now you have your free pass. So if anyone has anything that they saw in the book, or any thoughts they've had, even throughout the course of the conversation, or anything they'd like to say, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm kind of like Connor as well. I haven't read the book, so I don't want to act like I have and putting it out there. But I was just reading, I did as well. I think similar to Epi, well, I did like a module on like borders like last semester, and I think I was reading some like crazy facts, and I thought it was really interesting the way immigrants are kind of classed into like the true refugee and like someone who isn't. And I'm trying to think of the actual figures, but it was something like startling. Like it was 2015 as well, so it was a while ago. But I think like 98% of like Syrian refugees were like accepted into the EU. I think like 80% of people coming from Ghana were like rejected because they were economic refugees. And I just thought, I don't know if anyone else has any like more information on that or anything like that, but I thought that was so interesting how people are like classed based on where exactly they're coming from and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, Fiona, if you don't mind, I don't know, maybe this is wrong, but I feel like also there has been a lot of media coverage and like public pressure about Syrian refugees, but like I myself anyway would know far less about refugees coming from other circumstances from other countries. And because of this public pressure, governments are more likely to accept them because it's better optics to accept them from Syria rather than from another country where they're not under pressure. But that's not a valid reason to accept or reject someone. Like, it's not valid, but I think maybe that's part of the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. 100%. I guess like they're not maybe the main priority and people don't think so much, or just it's not, I don't know, brought up. And I guess if someone's not maybe necessarily like, I don't know, I guess it's hard to present in a way that is viewed as, I don't know, like favorable and actually like vulnerable. Whereas I guess if you are fleeing like a war, like it makes obviously 100% for everyone to come in, but makes so much easier to portray like they need to be given asylum somewhere. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think the economic migrant thing was huge. I don't think I had really even considered that as a term before I read this book, and I saw how hostile both people and states are towards people who are branded economic migrants. And we've talked a lot about, I think it was maybe Connor, I'm sorry if it was someone else that brought up the point about like, as Dinah said in the first like part of her book, like home was like fantastic until there was all of this violence and things like that. But I think so often we hear these narratives of people being like, oh, they're stealing our jobs and they're coming in and this, that, and the other. And as Kira said, we never hear about like migrants, from different places and things like that. And I think it's insane the disparity between someone who is coming to a country in, Europe, looking for a job, whether they're coming for economic reasons or because they're fleeing conflict, that compared to the fact that, as citizens of the EU, we can go, do you know what, I'm sick of Ireland and I want to work in Spain, so I'm just going to go there because I want to. And everyone's like, class, good for you, enjoy Spain, and it's like, what is going on like that? And I'm not even making a valid point here, I'm just ranting, but I think that's insane. So I don't know if anyone agrees with that, but that was just something that completely baffled me. And I think it's so strange how we have these different terms that carry so much weight when at the end of the day they are just people that are looking for safety and refuge and don't want to leave their homes but have been forced to for one reason or another.
Yeah, 100%. This is actually something Connor said earlier as well, and I have such an issue with it, and like how hypocritical it is for us as Irish people. Like we're such an obvious example in the most recent recession and then the recession back in like the 80s of like huge numbers of our population went away so that they could literally have a better life and make more money, find jobs, and then we think it's okay to like point the finger back at people for something we've just done. It's like, how dare we do that? It just feels so hypocritical. I have such a thing about it.
Even the situation Neve just described of somebody who wants to go to Spain to work because they can is closer to the idea of an economic migrant than any refugee. Like, that's more to the point that, but that person is never going to be labeled an economic migrant, in any way, like in any database. That's never going to happen. That's so interesting and so terrible in and of itself, hypocritical and all the worst words.
I think even with lockdown, like the way people are so like, don't close down the borders, like people have the right to go on holiday, like all this stuff. And then you're kind of going, but we do close the borders to certain people. We close the borders to like the most vulnerable in our societies in different countries. But like, because of like the Irish constitution and like the freedom to travel and all this stuff, like, no, you should be allowed to go to Spain when like the country's down to level 2. And like, I find that so frustrating. And I feel like this is probably like everyone feels this, like that we never closed our borders, that like I have a friend who went to Sicily in August, like what's going on? And then like people can't go to places where they really need to go to, they can't get the help and they can't set up their new lives. And like I think the pandemic's really like put a lot into perspective and like really kind of changed the way we view things, definitely for me anyway.
No, 100% happy. Again, just if anyone wants to make any sort of different last points, anything they want to bring up, just go ahead.
I just have one last point, sorry. One thing that struck me, and I think it came up, well, yeah, like Dina, how she always wanted to be like the best and prove her worth kind of, and like prove she adds something to this society to give back kind of in a way. And like, I think that's really sad that when like the West do then finally let in like a few refugees, they kind of make it like you have to be grateful and you have to prove your worth. And then like Dina like clearly felt that and felt like she always had to strive for the best. And one thing, I can't remember if she mentioned this in the book or not, but it reminded me of like maybe 2 years ago that there was a guy, and I'm not sure where he is from, but he was like waiting for status in France, and he scaled up the front of the building and saved a baby. And then I don't know if people remember that, but then Macron like gave him citizenship and also gave him a job, and like that was very nice of Macron then. But it's also like, is that really what you have to do? Like, you have to scale the front of a building in order to get status. Like, I have to do nothing. Like, I could be a horrible person and still my rights are always respected. Like, without a doubt, the Irish government and the EU just protect my rights regardless of what I do. But if you come from a different country, then you have to prove that you're exceptional even to get the most basic rights. And if you're like mean or react in any way differently, probably as a result of trauma that you faced sometimes, but also just in general, people will like kind of latch onto that and, you know, use that as like, oh, all refugees are terrible or something. And it's just kind of unfair. This was something that like stood out to me, unfair that refugees are then like held to a higher standard in our society. They have to prove themselves, which like no one has to prove themselves just for basic rights.
I fully agree with that, Emily. And like, sorry, I know we're running over time, but the prime example of that, which is really relevant at the moment, is the 28th Amendment. Or sorry, 27th, 28th? I think it's 28th. No, 27th. I think I'm getting mixed up with repeal the 8th. But anyway, the amendment there's an amendment in the Irish Constitution, maybe some of you heard of it, that basically, if you're born in Ireland, if your parents don't have Irish status, you're not actually Irish by definition, which is completely ridiculous. And like, I think it's on the table for, it's basically the next thing on the list now for trying to get it put to a referendum to remove it. Because it's completely shocking. And it is basically like the manifestation of what you said, Emily, where people are being held to completely arbitrary different standards that are hugely degrading. Like, how can you be told that you're born in a country and you don't belong to that country? And also what you were saying, Emily, about like maybe the origins of it stemming from just people being uncomfortable with it, or like, it's just such ridiculous things that lead to this. Like, I'm sure that at the time, and I'm fairly sure this is like what people would say and what analysts would say is the reason, is that there was a huge pushback in the media of like, this is in the 70s and 80s, of like, people are coming here, like people are coming to Ireland and intentionally having children so that they can stay here, and all this weird stuff that is completely like overtly racist, but just because it's in this context of a law, it's completely fine to just put it in the open. And yeah, I don't have much to add, Emily, but just to, I don't know, to add to what you were saying and agree with it and point to something like that as something that hopefully will be changed soon, and that is really just a manifestation of that in Ireland anyway, that like that is allowed to happen. And I feel like when that is put to referendum, because hopefully it will be, I'm hopeful it'll pass, but also I think it's going to be a kind of a shocking reality check for just how many people in Ireland actually have backwards views on this, because I feel like a lot of the discourse is going to be, as I said before, like just ridiculously racist, but it's kind of like with the excuse of like, but what about this? They can do this, and they being 25 different cultures from 25 different African countries, and like, it's like, who is they? Who are all these things that you're claiming about? I don't know. But I don't know, one for people to keep keeping an eye on moving forward is that amendment, I suppose.
Yeah, the cherry on the shit sundae that is the 27th Amendment is the fact that it was passed in 2004. Like, it was passed by referendum in 2004. Like, it was far too recently
that is
to have
depressingly
been
recent. Oh my god.
Yeah, like, like I was 8. I was a full human being with a mind and was reading a book like I when it was passed. That it's far too recent, and like you have to hope but it's one of those things where it's like if it was passed in the 60s, you could be like, oh well, we've come so far that now obviously everybody will vote differently. 2004 is so recent that everybody who voted then will almost certainly have the exact same views and will still be alive now. So it's going to be a hell of a battle to try and get that passed. But yeah, I do believe it is like the next major kind of social issue. Like after repeal the 8th, this was going to be like the next big one, because it's absolutely insane that it's in the Constitution, and it is wild and just like deliberately racist. Like I don't know what they put, like you're like, oh, this document that enshrines rights, but also like it's just racist and sexist and incredibly, up until recently, incredibly homophobic and incredibly misogynistic, and you're like, man, so good. 1930s Ireland, what a time. But yeah, that is the worst part of that, is that like it was so recent, and like you got to wonder, you got to hope that enough people have like as Conal said like several times, like we're preaching to the choir here. Like I can't imagine there's anybody here who'd be like, nope, I'm not gonna vote for that, like I'm gonna vote no. But it's a thing where we're gonna like, there'll be a lot of like, it's going to be about changing opinions. And again, we've said it a couple of times about like the people who need the books that we're reading and who need the these talks and these discussions aren't having them. And that's the real hard part, is that like, how are we going to convince everybody else who needs to hear this to go and hear it and go and read it and go and find out about it. But yeah, it's a real shame, but hopefully 27 will be gone soon enough, because it's truly atrocious.
Yeah, sorry, just a point to add to your point, Emily. Sorry for dragging this on. I'm so conscious I've been talking so much. And this isn't like a hate on France moment at all, but it was like another thing that came to my mind was around the time that France won the World Cup. And I remember a number of the players and like a number of people in the media were kind of talking about the players' African ancestry and how a number of the players were African immigrants. And then like the French government came out and they're like, no, all of these players are French. And then it's like, okay, they're fine to claim these people, these players, these international football stars as French, but a huge portion of their population, they refuse to claim as French just because they are African immigrants or they have this ancestry. And you just do see that it's like constantly governments are looking at like how exceptional these people have to be before we'll accept them as our own. It's just really sad to see.
I think sports stars is a really good example of people who are exceptional a lot of the time and then are still treated terribly. Like the amount of sports fans that are like just blatantly racist is like staggering. Like even just like not even from a refugee standpoint, but just from like English football is like an unbelievable example of like just people who are like Marcus Rashford single-handedly saved a bunch of children from going hungry over the course of the summer, and people are still, making racist chants at him at a football pitch every weekend. He got knighted for his service for doing work that the government should have been doing and actively weren't doing. And he was still playing football on the weekend and then also campaigning. And they're still like, no, you're still a terrible person. And he's born in England, like he's English by birth. Like think about like if somebody who's like English and is just has gone to that level, what bar is set for refugees and people and immigrants who come to the country and are like looking to be like, it's like the highest standard for the lowest like set of comforts. Like it's truly so unfair.
Oh, 100%. I'm just like realizing the time. If anyone does have anything they do want to add, that's no bother. But I think we'd be happy enough to wrap up. and just to say thank you so much to all of you. First of all, coming to the talk and then staying on. We've taken such a huge chunk out of your evening, so apologies for that, but it was so lovely to speak to you all, so thank you.
Huge thank you to Ciara and Neve for organizing an unbelievable event, and for, you know, not just getting Jane in to talk to us about which in a truly incredible and inspiring way, but then to continue to lead this book club in a really, really incredible and important, you know, incredibly important discussions. It was amazing. And you know what? Sometimes you don't need to read the book. Sometimes it's all in the conversation. And wait, is that no, never mind. No, you have to read the book. Homework is due. Just on a tangential note, just for people who may not have been at the MOM on Monday, the AGM is coming up for VDP, and everybody here should consider running or talking to their friends and getting people they want to run for the executive positions before I turn to dust and fade away, to run for the executive positions for next year's executive committee. You know, and everybody should consider it, should talk to their friends about running. It's 5th of April for the AGM, and then but you can nominate yourself or get your friends to start nominating themselves up until the 3rd of April. So you've got plenty of time, but just that everybody here should be considering running or talking to people about getting them to run, because you'd all be great and you should all consider it.
Thank you very much, Connie. That is fantastic. I am so aware of the time, but the only thing I want to say before we go is that I think there was a lot of talk tonight, and I know a few people said it, about how we're preaching to the choir. And I feel like that happens a lot in VDP. You know, you're talking to the people who already want to be engaged, the people who are already want to volunteer, who already want to take that next step. And it's like, if only I could get through to the people who don't want to do this. But I think for myself, definitely, and I suppose hopefully, like on behalf of me and Ciara, like the point of book club is self-education. It's that we're all like learning together. It's that we're all like looking at these issues together, talking about them, expanding our knowledge. And I suppose the power behind that is that then whenever we do come up against, you know, other people who don't share the same beliefs as us, if we do get to a point where there is a referendum for the 27th Amendment and we are met with people who are saying, well, why should we, you know, let these people have status? With the fact that we are educating ourselves and stuff, we can fight back and we can tell them, well, look, you have all these things that I've read about and I've listened to, and you're not just spouting it from your own brain. Well, you are a little bit, but you're not just spouting it from your own brain, like you have some backup to that. Because I feel like sometimes whenever we talk about these big social issues, you can feel kind of powerless and you can feel like, well, there's nothing I can do. Like I'm talking to the people who are already aware of them and things like that. So I suppose just to round off, I just want to say thank you all very much for coming. And I think this is how we kind of, you know, progress towards greater change, even though we are all just sitting on Zoom together. But I love that in itself. So yes, thank you all very much. And I hope to see you next month. Our topic for this month, I suppose March, is the environment and climate change. And if anyone has any last suggestions they would like to submit for books that they'd like to read this month, please send them our way, and check out for polls to do with books and stuff like that in the next few days, and please vote. And we hope to see you all very, very soon.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. That's amazing.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.